Good morning, everyone. This is time for our series called The Chapters of Moses. We're looking at the Pentateuch in sections and trying to show some of the great themes that are present in the Pentateuch as Moses put it together. Today we're going to center most of our thoughts on the book of Numbers. Now, in our English Bibles, it is called Numbers, and that tradition goes back to the Greek translation of the Old Testament, because there are two great numberings in the book of the people of Israel. One is in chapter 1, and one is in chapter 26, and these are very significant. But the original title of the book is not Numbers, even though the numbering is very significant, but it's part of the first verse that says in the desert or in the wilderness. It's in Hebrew, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. That's the title of the book. And the book is especially significant in biblical history because of what happened in the wilderness as the people were wandering in the wilderness. And this is particularly the stuff between Numbers chapter 11 and Numbers 22. Those are the passages or the chapters that are really the central part of what's called in the wilderness in this book. Now, we remember last time from Leviticus that when the tabernacle was completed, the actual building of the stuff in it was completed, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, then the book of Leviticus spelled out the regulations for the priests as they offered various sacrifices and so on, and we looked at the theological content of those. You know, the person is guilty of sin, God holds them guilty. The person must bring a sacrifice that's without defect, it's perfect, it's the best that they have. The person should lay their hands on the head of the animal that's to be sacrificed, identifying with the sacrifice. This should be me, but it's not, it's the animal. The blood of the animal, which is necessary for atonement, was to be sprinkled on the altar. The priest was the intermediary necessary to do the sacrificing and make atonement. The priest shall make atonement for his soul. It's repeated over and over again, and he shall be forgiven. So this ritual was repeated over and over again in sacrifices for sin, in fellowship offerings where the person sat and ate a meal with God, showing the good relationship between the person who sacrificed and God. And we talked about many of those things, and of course there's the great Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16, where once a year there was a great remembrance made of sin, and there were sacrifices made for the nation, and the hands were laid upon the head, and the one goat was sent away into the wilderness to symbolize the sending away of the sins, God forgiving and forgetting about those sins. Now, when the regulations, all of these regulations had been given to the priests, then we have the things that happened in the wilderness when God spoke to Moses in the book of Numbers. You'll notice in Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. Now, if you have your Bibles open there at Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, I want you to compare Exodus chapter 19 and verse 1. Because this is where, in Exodus 19, that the people arrived in the desert of Sinai, having left Egypt. Exodus 19:1. In the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. So 3 months after they left Egypt, they came to Mount Sinai, and then they camped around Mount Sinai. And it says in Numbers 1, verse 1, that when the Lord spoke to Moses on this time, it was the first day of the second month of the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So we're actually 11 months now after leaving Egypt. And 8 of those months has been spent camped around Mount Sinai. And the encampment at Sinai started in Exodus 19, and all the way through the rest of Exodus, and all the way through Leviticus, and unto this point is 8 months that they camped around Mount Sinai. And God told Israel, he told Aaron and Moses to take a census, to number the people of Israel at this point. These are the ones that were delivered out of Egyptian bondage. And so if you go down to verse 17 of chapter 1, Moses and Aaron took these men whose names had been given, and they called the whole community together on the first day of the second month. The people indicated their ancestry by their clans and families, and the men 20 years old or more were listed by name, one by one, as the Lord commanded. And so he counted them, he numbered them in the desert of Sinai. And he starts in verse 20 with the tribe of Reuben, and he gives you that, and he gives you the number in verse 21. There were 46,500 of these men. Then you have the tribe of Simeon. Down in verse 23, the number, there were 59,300 of them. Then he numbered the people of Gad, and on down through the various tribes. And you'll notice that the number of fighting men in each tribe was very different. They were all different numbers. And it starts with Reuben, and it goes all the way down until you get to verse 46. It says start with 45. All the Israelites, 20 years old or more, who were able to serve in Israel's army were counted according to their families, and the total number was 603,550. Now, if you compare that with Exodus 12 and verse 37, it says there in Exodus 12 and verse 37 that the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. See, that's an approximation, about 600,000 men plus women and children. Here it's very specific, the number. It's 603,550 of the men plus their women and children. These are the ones that came out of Egypt, that were 20 years old and upward, able to fight in the armies of Israel. Then the book of Numbers makes a big deal that the Levites were not counted along with the rest of the tribes of Israel. Starts this in chapter 1, verse 47, and says that these Levites were responsible for the service of the tabernacle, for its setup and takedown and all that. And if you go over to chapter 3, verse 11, this is elaborated on. The Lord said to Moses, I have taken the Levites from among the Israelites in the place of the first male offspring of every Israelite woman. The Levites are mine. For all the firstborn are mine. When I struck down the firstborn in Egypt, I set apart from myself every firstborn in Israel, whether man or animal. They are mine. I am the Lord. So because God saved the firstborn of Israel when he killed all the firstborn of Egypt, there was a price to be paid. There was a redemption price to be paid. If you go back and read Exodus 13. God decided that he would accept the men of the tribe of Levi in exchange for all the firstborn that he had saved. And these men were to serve in the interests of the tabernacle all the days of their life. And so this is what happened, and the Levites were set apart. Go to chapter 3, verse 2. See, in the book of Exodus, we set up the tabernacle with all of its holy things that God designated. In the book of Leviticus, the ordinances were given to the priests on how to make the offerings and operate in the tabernacle. And now he summarizes this in chapter 3, verse 2. He says, the names of the sons of Aaron, this is the priests, were Nadab, the firstborn, and Abihu, and Eleazar, and Ithamar. Those were the names of Aaron's sons, the anointed priests, who were ordained to serve as priests. They were ordained in Leviticus chapter 8, and God instructed them to be ordained in Exodus chapter 29. All right? So, Numbers 3 verse 4, Nadab and Abihu, however, fell dead before the Lord when they made an offering with the unauthorized fire before him in the desert of Sinai. And they had no sons, so only Eleazar and Ithamar served as priests during the lifetime of Aaron. And the Lord said to Moses, bring the tribe of Levi and present them to Aaron the priest to assist him. So the Levites were to assist the priests, and they were given to God, you might say, in exchange for the firstborn of all the people. Now, there's some very interesting stuff in Numbers chapter 2 about the camp of Israel. If you can draw a rectangle on a piece of paper and draw smaller rectangles around the perimeter of that rectangle, on the east side of your rectangle, in Numbers chapter 2 verse 3, you have the camp of Judah, and that included the people from the tribe of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And there's a lot of people there. 74,600 plus 54,400 plus 57,400. That many people, that many men. So that's the camp on the east side. So draw that on the east side of your rectangle. Then verse 10, on the south side was the camp of Reuben, and that included the tribe of Reuben, 46,500, the tribe of Simeon, 59,300, and the tribe of Gad. So on the south side of your rectangle, draw a rectangle that has that. And this is the outer perimeter of the camp of Israel. Then you'll, on the verse 18, on the west side, you have the camp of Ephraim, which includes Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then verse 25, on the north side is the camp of Dan, which has the tribes of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And so those four camps, north, south, east, and west, formed the perimeter of Israel. But inside of those camps were four more camps. So there was an outside perimeter, and only Israelites were to be inside that camp. And then there was an inside perimeter with four more spaces on it. And on the north, the west, and the south, you had the tribes of the families of Levi. And he tells us in chapter 3, those were the Gershonites, the family of Gershon, and the Kohathites, the family of Kohath, and the Merariites, the family of Merari. Those were on the north, the west, and the south. And on the east side were the priests. So on the outer perimeter, you had the four different camps of the tribes of Israel, and on the inner perimeter, you had the four camps of the Levites, Gershon, Kohath, Merari, and then the priests on the inner perimeter. And then inside of both of those perimeters, in the very center, was the tabernacle itself, the courtyard of the tabernacle, the holy place, and the most holy place. So the very camp of Israel was symbolically the barrier between Israel and all other people in the world, and then the barrier between the Israelites, all the Israelites, and the holy tribe of Levi on the inside that served the tabernacle. And then finally the barrier in the tabernacle itself, where only priests could go, see, and the number got smaller. And then finally the last place, the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, where only the high priest could go. And that would be just one time a year. So even the way the camp was arranged in the book of Numbers has the theology in it that God is hard to approach. that there are barriers between man and God, and those barriers are difficult to erase. A person had to be ceremonially clean, like it talks about in the book of Leviticus. A person had to bring the appropriate sacrifice, and the blood had to be spilled in order to approach anywhere near God. And it was necessary to have a priest to aid you in coming close to God. All of these things were important. And of course, in the finishing out of everything associated with the tabernacle and its worship, the duties of all these different priests and Levites are laid out in the early chapters of the book of Numbers. Now, if you go down to chapter 6 of Numbers, and it gives a blessing, a prayer that the priests were to say for the people. And it's in chapter 6, verse 24. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. In other words, he's going to look at you and be happy with you. And may he be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you as opposed to away from you. And may he give you peace. And so they, that is the priests, will put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them. See, it was always God's desire to bless his people, to live among his people, and to bless his people. This was his promise to Abraham. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and whoever blesses you I will bless, and whoever curses you I will curse. So all this stuff was built, and Moses got it in place. And then there were offerings, great offerings, free will offerings given for the tabernacle. And the different tribal heads brought these offerings to the tabernacle, and it lists them in Numbers chapter 7 and the offerings that they brought. And that goes all the way down through Numbers 7, verse 83. And then it says in verse 84, these were the offerings of the Israelite leaders for the dedication of the altar when it was anointed. And then it summarizes all of those offerings. And then it says in verse 89, when Moses entered the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from between the two cherubim above the atonement cover on the Ark of the Covenant, and he, that is God, spoke with him, that is, with Moses. So on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, where those cherubim were, and their wings were coming together like that, God spoke to Moses from that place. And he told him about the putting of the lamps on the oil lamp in the tabernacle, and how they were to be placed, and how that was to be done. And he told them about the offerings to sanctify the Levites for service in the tabernacle, getting all this set up. And he mentions again down in verse 17, chapter 8, verse 17. Every firstborn male in Israel, whether man or animal, is mine. When I struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, I set them apart for myself. And I have taken the Levites in place of all the firstborn sons in Israel. Of all the Israelites, I have given the Levites as gifts to Aaron and his sons to do the work at the tent of meeting on behalf of the Israelites. So, verse 20, Moses, Aaron, and the whole Israelite community did with the Levites as the Lord commanded Moses. Then chapter 9, see, they've got all this set up, and it's been like 11 months since they left Egypt. They observed the Passover for the first time. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they came out of Egypt. Now, let me show you something real quickly. Look at chapter 9, verse 1 there. And go back to chapter 1 and verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai. This is chapter 1, verse 1. On the first day of the second month after they came out of Egypt. Well, if you read carefully in chapter 9, verse 1, this is a month earlier. See, chapter 9, verse 1 is actually earlier than chapter 1, verse 1. So this is not all in chronological order. And he told them to observe the Passover, as they were commanded in Exodus 12 and 13. And so they did that. And they got that the way the Lord wanted it to be. And it talks about how God's presence filled the tabernacle. And so everything was ordained as God wanted it to be. And then God told them to make some silver trumpets so the priests could blow those trumpets at the sacrifices and at the moving of the camp. And then in chapter 10, verse 11, very important here time-wise, on the 20th day of the second month of the second year. Now see, they got to Mount Sinai on the third month of the first year. But now it's the 20th day of the second month of the second year. See, it's almost 12 months, but not quite, since they left Egypt. The cloud lifts up off of the tabernacle, and it moves off, and the camp breaks up, and they begin to follow the pillar of cloud out into the desert, out into the wilderness. And this begins the time of Bamidbar, as the book of Numbers is called, out in the wilderness. See? And this starts in chapter 11. Now, this period of Numbers 10:22, when they left, all the way to Numbers 22, verse 1, takes up about 38 years of the 40 years that they were in the desert. And if you go to Numbers 22, verse 1, then the Israelites traveled to the plains of Moab and camped along the Jordan across from Jericho. Well, see, that's where they stayed until they entered into the land of promise. That is the new generation of Israelites. So up until Numbers chapter 11, Numbers 10 and 11, you've got about 1 year that takes place. And then from Numbers 11 all the way through Deuteronomy, you've got 39 years, basically, that takes place. And most of that time is the time which you could call in the wilderness, or wandering in the wilderness, from Numbers chapter 11 to Numbers chapter 22. Now, this section of Numbers is very important, because in Hebrews chapter 3, starting with verse 7, the Bible says, "Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as your fathers did in the provocation, in the rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness." Notice that phrase, in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Well, in the wilderness, in the rebellion. Well, that's about the book of Numbers, and that's about this section in the book of Numbers from chapter 11 through chapter 22. I want to show you some interesting things about this section. And if there's one word that could really explain this section of Numbers, it's the word rebellion. Rebellion. And there are several words that go along with this word rebellion. You've got the word in some of your Bibles, murmured. Some of your Bibles will say grumbled or grumbling. And you've got the word quarreled. They quarreled with Moses. They murmured. They grumbled against Moses. You've got the word wailed or wept, where they wept as they murmured and complained and grumbled and quarreled. This was all about rebellion. So look with me. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now the people complained. That's the little Hebrew word loon, which means to grumble, to complain, to murmur, to speak rebelliously. See? Against God. And notice the anger of the Lord was aroused because of this attitude. Go down to verse 4. It says the Israelites started wailing or weeping. You've got that same statement in verse 10. Heard the people of every family wailing. See, they were crying about not having meat. And in verse 18, the Lord heard you wailing. Down at, in this particular incident in Numbers 11, God gave them meat to eat. He gave them the quail, and they ate it till it came out their noses, and they were so lustful for the meat. They didn't care about God. They just wanted meat. And God killed a bunch of them with a plague, and they called the place the graves of lust because their lust took over. Chapter 12, Miriam and Moses and Aaron began to speak against Moses. See, they're complaining. And verse 9, the anger of the Lord burned against them. Of course, Miriam was turned leprous, and there's a story there. And then in chapter 13, God sends out the spies, you remember, into the land of Canaan to spy it out, and they come back. 10 of them come back with a bad report. And at the beginning of chapter 14, that night all the people of the community raised their voices and wept, and all the Israelites grumbled. They murmured. They complained. They spoke rebelliously, say, against Moses. And Caleb and Joshua says in verse 9, do not rebel against the Lord. See, God told them to go up, and they said, no, we can't. We'll get killed. We can't do it. And God says down in verse 11 to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me? Drop down to verse 36. Numbers 14:36. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land returned and made the whole community grumble, murmur, complain against the Lord. And of course there was a plague, and the only ones that survived were Joshua and Caleb. Go over to chapter 16. You've got Korah and Dathan and Abiram. They lead these 250 men in a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and they want to be priests even though God did not choose them, set them apart to be holy as priests. And so God destroys them. Down in verse 11, this word grumble. Is it against the Lord that you and all your followers have banded together? Who is it that you should grumble, murmur, complain against him? You have after God kills Korah and all of his followers and swallows them up in the ground. Verse 41, chapter 16. The next day the whole Israelite community grumbled again, murmured, complained, rebelled. Chapter 17, they're grumbling in verse 5. And in verse 10, they're grumbling and complaining. And so, again, they're being rebellious against God. In chapter 20, the people are quarreling. Verse 3, because they don't have any water. And Moses gets so frustrated with the people, he even rebels against God, see? So, bottom line here, the book of Numbers is about rebellion. What happens is, during this wandering in the wilderness and all this rebellion, through one plague or whatever and another, God ends up wiping out these rebels. And by the time you get to Numbers 25, when 24,000 of them roughly are killed in verse 9, the old generation has been done away with, because all of those 603,000 people that came out of Egypt have rebelled against God, and God's killed them, except for Joshua and Caleb. And then we have in chapter 26 the counting, the numbering of the new nation. Now the point of this is God made a promise. He said, I will make of you a great nation. And even though he had to kill the first nation because they rebelled against him in the rebellion in the wilderness, book of Numbers, he raised up a new generation. And when you count the numbering in chapter 26 of the new generation of all the fighting men, if you go down to verse 51, chapter 26, verse 51, the total number of the men of Israel now was 601,730. So he killed the first 600,000, and he raised up another 600,000. God keeps his promises even when man rebels. And so if you think about the book of Numbers and where it fits thematically into the Pentateuch, the book of Numbers is how God brought his people to the edge of the promised land, and they rebelled against him, and they rebelled during the wilderness, and he destroyed that generation and built a new generation. See, it's about rebellion against God and where that takes us. We don't want to be rebels against God. We want to be people that do God's will. Lord willing, next week we'll take a look at the book of Deuteronomy. I hope you have a great week. God bless you.
Faithful love flowing down from the thorn-covered crown makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love calms each fear, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love from above came to earth to show the Father's love, and I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name. For I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name.